Hi, I'm Steve Grzesik. I am actually a trained, degreed graphic designer. I was an art director for several years. Um, and I have taken those graphic design that training skills and experience and translated them to a passion I have generationally of woodworking. So this is a piece that I decided to make based on James Krenoff's designs of a chest on stant, which is ancient, goes back to, I believe, even Egyptian times. You'll certainly see a lot of this in the medieval and Renaissance era, Versailles, etc. But this is my own twist on what that is. And I did start with a Krenoff book looking at what he did, and they gave a rough dimension for height, and I scaled it off of the photographs in there. So I had a very, very good place to start with proportions that I thought worked, which is very important to get rid of a lot of the trial and error out of it.
Okay, Steve and I have been talking here for a few minutes on some of the details of this piece, and I mean, this is spectacular. So, Steve, tell us about, just why did you do all this stuff? Let's start right here.
Um, Partially is nothing exceeds like excess, and I heard a speech or a lecture given by John Nyquist, a contemporary and competitor of Sam Maloof, and one of the things he went out on is you need to have a theme on something. I didn't necessarily agree with how he put it on there, but there is something to hang the piece on, was the point he was getting at. So when I construct a piece, I try to have that theme or design element, trickery, if you want to call it, to tie the entire piece together.
And tell me about the wood.
So there are three woods basically on this. The spotty looks like trout skin is quarter sawn California sycamore. Flat sawn is horrid, just very nasty looking and plain. So this is the quarter sawn edge on it. And the base and part of the top, which you'll see a little later, is just plain cherry, no big deal about it. The doors themselves are made out of basswood, which is very easy to carve. And since I've never carved anything before, I wanted to um, basically give myself a little bit of latitude on how to make it easy as possible. There's one other last element, and that is the drawer pulls, the plugs, the doorknobs are all made out of beetle or betel nut, which is kind of hard to get unless you want vast quantities of it. And the figure on that kind of ties in with the sycamore.
So these details, the little, these guys are beetle nut also.
Correct.
That's amazing. Why did you do them all different sizes? I like that.
My, I guess, default woodworking design inspiration has been green and green, and this is an element that they used that I've kind of tweaked to my own advantage. Theirs were almost always ebony. I've used a lot of ebony, but I've also used whatever the base wood is, something, so they don't really show out. But these are, I term functional because anything is designed to me as functional. But behind them are, each one of them are dowels that structurally hold this together. So the cross pieces and the legs are not glued together. They're doweled. The dowels have glue on them, and that's it. So the doors themselves are bowed outward. Um, did that by coopering the doors first and then following that carving line. This internal drawer structure here is also bowed out. The drawers themselves are bent lamination, 8 layers, sorry, um, as are these two side pieces here. This was all made at one time and then cut into the individual pieces. Right at the end, because there's structural joinery behind this, I glued this laminate off the front. These are all shop made laminates, by the way. And if you notice, this is one continuous piece across there as it came out of the veneer.
Talk about the difference of the contrast between this elegantly crafted sycamore and the wildly crazy leaves.
Yeah, I kind of work in a process method. I have very detailed drawings, an idea in my head, and then when I really start to look at stuff and cutting wood and moving on that process, I will refer to the drawings, but not religiously so. It's where is the project leading me? What happens here? Some of the stuff is in your control, some of it's not. We'll get to some of some of that details later. And how this all gets crazy together is sycamore drastically changes. It looks like you've sometimes done a laminate or rather a joined piece of wood, and it's not, because if you look at the way the grain goes, it starts and stops. It's really very interesting to see how that gets put together, as opposed to something that's like the cherry that I used here, which is very simple and dull in contrast to it. But making this entire thing out of sycamore would have been ridiculous. It would have been even too much over the top for me.
Some of the things that I really love to see are these. The tops are not square;
They're domed.
pillowed,
Well, pillowed is a word. Yeah, that would work. I refer to them as domed, but yes,
domed,
Domed, like a dome.
domed.
Domed. Yeah. So
Okay,
these are domed. The plugs are domed. The joinery on the fingers are domed
okay.
also. So they're proud and stick out, which means they stick out. And then they are domed also. So that's a repeating element, which is actually a design tool. One of the basic essentials of making good design is that's one of the things you can do is repeat an element throughout a process or a project, so that it helps tie the entire piece together to one unified look, as opposed to things that are just stacked on top of each other, glued together. So for a little bit of scale, I'm like 6'2", if you get an idea of what the height is. I did a series of drawings that went up to Rev 10, and then I started doing this, which doesn't look anything like that, because this is the rendering I made of Rev 10 right off the drawing. You'll notice that the ends are beveled on this. The tops of the legs themselves are actually compound mitered. But I started out with a plain bowed door. The minute I put this element, carved, etc., pierced, gilded, it made it, all these other parts of it, too over the top. There was too much going on, distracted from what I really wanted to show, which was this. The other thing you'll probably notice is that in the drawing, in most cabinets, doors are straight up and down in the middle. I decided that that was not very fun. So by having this puzzle piece together, it adds yet another element of making it unique.
Hey, you know, tell me some more thoughts on your design process. Not necessarily for this piece, but just in general. Your thoughts on the design process.
Well, I have several, and some of them are pretty advanced, as you might expect to see or hear. Others are very basic. And the basic ones, in a way, are far more important than some of the other ones. And that is the wood basically the same color? Did it? Hopefully, it came from the same tree or the same board. That helps out a whole lot. So that it matches. But if it doesn't match. And do you need to do? How do you deal with that? Grain direction is very important too. Does the grain along a piece of wood parallel the actual borders of that piece of wood? So I'm going to assume that everybody knows the difference between quarter sawn, rift sawn, flat sawn, etc. If not, we can deal with that at a later time. But whenever you have end grain showing, as it does here quite prominently, the grain on the end shows also. And it might not be noticeable when you do it right, but frequently it can be noticeable when you do it wrong. So these are between quarter and rift sawn. So the grain in here runs basically this direction, but it's not dead on. And these came from the same piece, one right after the other. So I aligned them in a way that the end grain here bevels down this direction. This one bevels down the other direction.
Okay, let's take a minute and understand that completely. The grain, it's almost impossible to see on the video, but on this side the grain is going down, and on this side the grain is going from left to right. So it's these subtle things that really make the difference between a beautiful piece and a spectacular piece. What are other examples of your grain, your concern for the totality of the grain?
Whenever I can, and it shows a little bit here. You'll never get it totally perfect piece. The grain on these cross pieces arcs a little bit. So trying to find those pieces is not necessarily the hardest thing in the world, but just being aware that they're there. By the way, that I angled these down and is throughout the piece. So they're angled in and downward, or they could be upward, and whatever works for you. So it's consistency throughout the piece that makes it look whole. It makes it look like it's thought out, because in essence, it is thought out. One other very important thing is I talked about it briefly, is repeat and to help tie something together. So if you look at these pieces, they're all look like they're the same width or thickness this direction. They're not. They look like it, but they're not. Everything is adjusted slightly so that optically they are the same. And then you'll see repeats on things like the spaces. Negative space is hugely important. Don't just look at the positive space on pieces that have negative space, because that can help make or break how pieces go together, how they look ultimately. The Japanese even have a term and design element for it called notan, N-O-T-A-N, which they go through a lot. Even on the doors piece, where these pieces are pierced through all the way, so I can stick my finger through, how that looked on the drawing that I made, I wanted to make sure that this negative space, which is why you saw the drawing in black and white, is why I did it in black and white, because it highlights that what is the negative space going to look like, as opposed to just a line drawing where you can't really tell. Some of the renderings I did are black, so that it helps me have a better understanding of the weight of the pieces itself and what the shapes are actually going to look like.
One of the things that I really see in this front is the balance, and it's not dissonant. There's a lot going on, but it's all balanced. Even the colors, you've got the five lighter bronze looking ones spaced out like perfectly, It's just it just feels good to look at the front door.
There is a term for this. You've heard symmetry. Then there's asymmetry. There is actually a design term that's called asymmetrical symmetry. It, it is not symmetrical, but it's balanced so that it feels like it is, even though it's not. So these are not symmetrical at all, but there's enough elements there that it works.
Oh my goodness, there's more.
Absolutely. There's always more. Nothing exceeds like excess. So basically, I thought I refer to it as a crown. It's part of this Jenga kind of game pile of sticks that I had on top originally from the drawing. You might see it up here. I thought that was going to be too excessive, so I didn't put it on originally. And then when I stood back and looked at it, because I do a lot of that, it looks like to me this piece was just laid on top of there, which it really legitimately is, but it's not incorporated into it. So I decided to go back to that crown and see what was going to happen.
Okay, go ahead.
What are we?
Take your time because we can.
Yeah. Oh, you came out. That's what looked funny.
I purposely left the layer finish off here because I figured doing all this need to.
Make it look pretty anyway. Percussive adjustment. How does that look? There. Yes. Okay.